Good evening and welcome. I'm Nina Rovanelli Heller. I'm the Dean of the UConn School of Social Work, and we are delighted to have you all here this evening. And as the panelists were talking as we were getting ready for this, I learned that we're going to have people from Japan here. We're going to have other global partners here. So we're really delighted. As we were saying, we like to be able to meet in person, but this really is allowing our global community to come together, and we're thrilled about that. So we're welcoming you here tonight to hear some of the top scholars on global work and global social work, and particularly joining to talk about our faculty members' newest book, which is the International Social Work Professional Action in an Independent World. And I know you're going to hear lots that's exciting and new, and really be able to hear a conversation among our panelists about what's happening now and where the profession is moving. So again, we are delighted to have you, and I'm now going to turn this over to Professor Louise Simmons, who will introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, and welcome everybody. The numbers seems to be growing as we of people in the audience, so we welcome all of you. This is a very exciting time for us to have our own colleagues come out with such an important book at this time, and it's just a wonderful way to celebrate this book, their work, and the whole enterprise of international social work. I'm going to first introduce our two professors who are part of this, and then our guest. So Dr. Rebecca Thomas is an associate professor and director of the School of Social Work Center for International Social Work Studies. She is chair of the Commission on Global Social Work Education and represents the International Association of Schools of Social Work on the NGO Committee on Migration at the UN, and is at the UN quite a lot, if not in person, virtually. And she is co-author of this book. Dr. Lynn Healy is a Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. She's lectured and consulted in more than 25 countries. She's spent many years here educating all kinds of students, and they found her work to be fantastic. Dr. Healy is currently the main representative to the United Nations in New York for the International Association of Schools of Social Work. And our guest, I guess you might call her our guest interlocutor, we're so pleased to have. Dr. Jody Olsen served as the most recent director of the Peace Corps from 2018 to 2021. This capped off a long career of service in the Peace Corps and other international development organizations, including the post of Deputy Director of the Peace Corps from 2001 to 2009. Prior to her appointment as Peace Corps Director, she was a visiting professor and director of the campus Center for Global Education Initiatives at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Now, the way we're going to run this is when I stop talking, Dr. Olsen will begin a conversation with Rebecca and Lynn, and we ask you to put any in the audience. We're so happy to have you to put your questions in the Q&A file of this. And then at the end of the session, the last section will be questions and answers that our two wonderful student workers, Emily Duzlak and Emma Hines, will ask the panelists. And we want to give a big shout out to Milagros Marrero Johnson for helping to put this all together. Without her, you wouldn't be seeing us. So take it away, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to join two illustrious faculty members. I might note that when I first went to the University of Maryland School of Social Work, now about 11 years ago, Lynn Healey, I don't think, Lynn, you fully appreciated it. You were my mentor. We met at the International Social Work Education activities. I felt, even though I was older in age, I was new to this particular field. And your gentleness, thoroughness in appreciating the academics of international social work and the importance of international social work really drew me into this field and has really kept me strong with it. Rebecca and I got to meet just a few years later. And through all of this, I've had a chance to come to UConn a couple of times, one for a conference and one to give a talk. But I want to do a special honor to both Rebecca and Lynn, because the University of Connecticut is lucky to have such outstanding faculty running international social work and being the global leaders in international social work, which is why this book is so extraordinary. So I'm going to begin by asking each of the two authors, Dr. Healy and Dr. Thomas, two questions to frame what the discussion is going to be tonight. Because these questions and these two questions help give us an outline, whether we're practitioners, teachers, researchers, or students. One, and I'll ask both of you each of the questions going forward, and you can decide how you want to manage the discussion. You two did such a beautiful job as being co-editors and co-authors of this book. I'm sure you're going to do a fabulous job in working and together answering the questions. So the first question is, how do you define international social work? Give a working definition of international social work to give us a common beginning point for the conversation. Your first chapter of the book, wait a minute, book, so exciting, includes an excellent discussion of the terms and how critical international social work is in our increasingly globalized society. So, definitions.
I think Rebecca wanted me to start with that because this is actually the third edition. So this book has been under development for about 20 years. And I think definition was one of the challenging pieces when I began thinking about this book back in the late 1990s. And part of the reason I'm going back a little bit, but part of the thinking behind the definition was that at the time I started this work, a lot of the writings about international social work were very general. It's nice to have a worldview because educated people should have a worldview. And to me, that just didn't speak to social work, because social work, yes, we do think about things, but we do things. We're an action profession. So I felt that it had to be strongly linked to people's professional roles and also to values. So Rebecca certainly helped me refine this as we went through this edition. But we say that international social work the intent is to promote human rights and enhance human well-being at home and around the world. And then we have a 4-part definition. Some of the parts apply to potentially all social workers and others are more specialized. So we define it as those aspects of domestic practice that are influenced in some way by international events and issues, of course, including the movement of people. And because social workers, we have 2 roles. We practice, but we also are supposed to improve our well-being and our policy. the capacity to influence domestic policy that relates to international issues. Secondly, we include the idea of international exchange and exchanging information with people in other countries in order to improve social work. Third, a more specialized role that Jody Olsen fulfills, which is the idea of international practice itself, devoting a career to international development work. And then the fourth one probably is mostly done by relatively few people, but potentially we could all be involved. And that's policy advocacy at the global level. Especially now we can do so much by technology, you know, everybody can speak up. So if you look at the book, at some point you'll see that each of these is illustrated with an actual case example, again, just to underscore the fact that we are a doing profession.
Rebecca, anything to add?
Yeah, I just think about the deep discussions we had as we were refining and thinking through the definition, and just highlighting, you know, examples of how each of these four components played a part in our own development of being both scholars and practitioners in the field. And so the definition really fits very well with just the way we operate and think through social work practice and engagement.
Thank you. Thank you. And what your definition gives us is really an introduction to my second question. And the second question is, why should all social workers and social work students, that all social workers have awareness and knowledge of international issues and the international social work perspective? How is it relevant for local practice here in the United States, even in communities where international influences are not obvious? And you all helped frame the answer to that question in the first two subsets of the definition of international social work. So go for it.
Yeah, I think, I know we live in a highly globalized world. And as a world, in some sense, has become so much smaller because of our access of technology and engagement and the way we engage with people. And just the movement of people from different countries to different spaces, we're encountering a diverse group of practitioners and clients that we're intersecting with, right? So even social workers that are operating, say, strictly in a small community will encounter clients or persons from another country. You might experience them in the school, in the classroom, in health systems, in just even as colleagues, looking at the criminal justice system. So in every phase of interaction, our world is so much more complex, and engagement with people, because we're interested in not only economic development of people, but of human development and social development of people. And so our engagement and understanding a much more global context is really important. And as Lynn laid out in the definition of what is international social work, I think we're in the business of advancing people's opportunities. So social workers really need to be equipped with new knowledge, with competencies, to be able to deal with not only cultural competency, but cultural humility. We do, as social workers, have shared values with other professionals in the field of social work all across the globe. And so even as our world becomes much more smaller, I think the division between foreign and domestic becomes so much more closer in a way. And so to understand and to respond to both local problems and global problems, we need to really understand the complex connectivity, both from the local to the global. And often the term local is being used increasingly, both local and global. So I don't think anymore we can separate one from the other. The intersectionality is so so prevalent.
I totally agree. And Lynn, do you have anything to add?
Just a little bit. I think sometimes, you know, working with students over the years, I find that sometimes it's a revelation to students that really the clients that they're dealing with do have international connections. And one of the things that was particularly powerful, I remember one of my students talking about how she was working with the Veterans Administration and realizing that soldiers who'd been deployed, especially recently those who'd been deployed to the Middle East, that experience was so significant to trying to work with them toward their psychosocial healing, that if you weren't sensitive to the fact of what it would mean for a 19-year-old to suddenly be serving in the military in Afghanistan, and you weren't interested particularly in that dimension, that you could really do harm by simply not being sensitive to international. Just another piece, I believe that we can't really understand our domestic policy issues if we don't have any basis of comparison. So, you know, when you go down to the legislature and try to advocate for something like a family leave policy, and the politicians in the business community say it's impossible, it would destroy the economy, you know, it really helps to know that every country in Europe has this, and a number of countries in other parts of the world. So, you know, you're a little more informed to be able to say, well, you know, if it didn't destroy the economy of Germany, why would it destroy ours? So I think you can't really understand where you are without knowing what's happening somewhere else.
Absolutely. And I find just in my years, both at the school and with Peace Corps, a growing interplay among all of us globally, part of it just happening to be here in the United States. I would like us to now look a little deeper into the content of the book. Now, from my own experience as an international social work faculty member for 8 years, until just 3 years ago, and then all the rest of my career in international development and exchange, this book is the most complete and comprehensive text I have seen on the topic, including both for academics and practitioners. See, Rebecca and Lynn can't quite say this because they're the authors of the book, but I can. And I love this book. And just to give a quick example, when I taught international social work, I was using the second edition, which is not as thick as the third edition, which tells you, and we're going to get into it in a few minutes, how much the world has grown in international social work just in the past 10 years. But what I found when I was teaching, the book was my core, because it gives such a perfect grounding for all the students. Because most students taking an international social work course don't have much background in international social work, in human rights, in transmigration, in migration, in different practices around the world. A lot of this is new. This book gives so much background and gives such a positive base structure that I found that for teaching, I would then use the classroom for the conversations, for the stories, for the examples, for them, the students pulling out their own perspectives, because the book gives the grounding on all these elements we need to know for international social work. And even just in the 2 or 3 weeks that I've had my own personal copy, I have been marketing to many other people, whether they're in social work or not, because I keep now referring to the various chapters and say, you must read this chapter or that chapter, because it's a grounding unlike I've seen in any other book on this general topic. So I'm your advertisers, I'm your advocates. Now,
Thank you.
now I'm going to come back to you. As I said, I used the second edition for my teaching for 8 years, but now we're talking 12 years later. Well, not 12 years since I used it, but 12 years since the second edition. And In preparing the third edition, I'm really curious. What did you discover as important changes in this field of international social work? Any surprises?
Well, since social work is so embedded in the larger environment, I think we were looking at, how has the world changed? And that was actually rather overwhelming, because the number of changes since between 2008 and 2020 were just enormous. And a lot of the things that had happened really had direct impact on social work. And one of the things that we point out a little bit in the preface, and then again in several of the chapters, is that growing inequality is a major theme. That certainly the world has always been unequal, but there's been a lot of documentation on how unequal it's become, both within countries such as our own or internationally. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking at what's called a UN side event, and it was actually on digital learning, digitization and the digital divide. And after thinking about global issues, I decided instead to use Hartford, Connecticut as my example in terms of how unequal access to technology was leaving students behind educationally. So we don't have to go far to see how a global issue is right here. Another piece, I think, is climate change, awareness of how dire things are in terms of climate and the number of natural disasters and the impact on people. Rebecca will I'm sure have more to say about this, but we went through this period of everybody in Europe and North America talking about refugee crisis. I always put that in quotation marks because I'm not really sure it was a crisis, but it benefited a lot of politicians to call it a crisis. And that had led to a tremendous amount of backlash and xenophobia, which we all have to deal with. In terms of, I guess on the positive side, I saw, an enormous explosion of interest in the topic of international social work. Lots more people are writing a lot of very good things, which was both a benefit and a problem for us because the amount of literature we had to look at was really daunting. And yeah, the book grew. The second edition was bigger than the first, and the third one is bigger than the second. So I told Rebecca, if there's a fourth, it's all in her. It's all in her lap. I guess one thing I would say about surprises in the broader surprises in terms of does it challenge our basic premise about the importance of globalization is that, a couple of years ago, our then president gave a speech to the UN in which he said globalism is dead. And, the new ethic has to be every country for themselves and closing in. And, that's a direct challenge to this idea of how do we work together? How do we solve our global issues with community? And I thought, that to me was the shocking, that and what I saw as some global pushback on the premises around human rights, which I think maybe we have a chance to chat about a little bit later in this session. But, I think those were real surprises, negative surprises for the most part, but positive surprises in terms of social work and social work's interests.
Yeah, I think, the major events were, I was just thinking about the fiscal crisis of 2008 and the ripple effects and how it impacted poverty in itself. Certainly, increasing war in countries of Africa and war in Syria and just civil unrest created environments in which there was a rise of refugees moving across borders, mostly going to neighboring countries for refuge, but then also taking major risks crossing seas to get to Europe or come to the border of the US and other nation states. Certainly the violence in Central America, causing people to move, increase, and also because of climate change, the forced migration, right? The migration because of lack of food and food scarcity, forcing migrants to keep moving to find safe and comfortable environments in which to live. I remember also the rise of the Arab Spring during, in which there were some movements arise to change the system as is, and just young people acting and organizing in ways that would wanted to overthrow an oppressive system. So I think a lot of energy, more awareness. I think, Jody, both you and I had lots of conversations about the rising notes of terrorism and also thinking about homegrown terrorism as it seems relevant now, and how, security issues seems to be an important part in the whole development conversation of things. So, the world has changed dramatically since the last book till now. And so I think the interdependency and the complexity of the issues was quite sharp. Certainly we've seen the rise of xenophobia, and then, the rise of populism happening in multiple nation states, thinking of the Brexit and thinking of people pulling away and wanting to follow an isolationist policy that's not useful for a response to some global concerns, such as climate change, such as poverty, such as economic independence, such as the rise of globalization that creates environments for interdependency. So those were some of the thinking that went into organizing the book. Certainly what really helped was the case studies that enhanced the topics of that we were talking about, so that it had practical implications for students to really take heed.
Thank you. I want to, before moving on, pick up on a note that Lynn made about how countries are more responsible for themselves. You said it much better. But just in these last 3 years with Peace Corps, as we worked across with government officials in 61 different countries, and knowing about the politics that were kind of swirling up here somewhere, that coming back to both Lynn and Rebecca's points, what we found and I found was such an eagerness of interest across the countries and between the United States and all these other countries about how do you do this? How can we learn from you? Tell us more about what's happening in your country for us to know more about ours. And I might note, and we're going to talk a little bit about COVID in a little bit, but knowing that COVID and how countries were managing COVID, everybody was watching everybody, including the US, and the kinds of questions that we would get. Well, how are you doing it this way? Why? What can we learn or not learn? What can we teach you? That these conversations on all of these topics are alive and well at a genuinely horizontal base, on a genuinely horizontal basis that I have found fascinating over these past few years. Now, you alluded to some specific issues that are discussed very, very well in the book. And these are, I think, among the most critical international global social work issues. So I'm going to touch on them. And if you could quickly give just a quick summary of how these particular issues touch on international social work. So the first one is poverty.
So Lynn addressed the issue of poverty. We see definitely the rise of disparity and the accumulation of wealth among an increasingly small group of people, and that poverty is really pervasive, and it's increasing both in high income and in low income countries. And I think it's one of our greatest challenges for international social work, international development, and to think about, what are the major challenges to development? And I think poverty seems to be the central key, and that poverty really must not be seen as just in a particular locale, but that it definitely crosses borders and boundaries, and that poverty only should not be seen as a lack of income, not only in economic terms, but that it needs to be recognized as a way of thinking about how can we make changes so that there can be sustainable development, sustainable, livable, healthy livelihoods. And that, that extreme poverty has manifestations in hunger, in starvation, malnutrition, just exclusion from real participation in life and in the quality of life and engagement. So if you begin to think about poverty in that context, the roles of social worker is really critical because we work with populations that don't have access, that have need a voice of advocacy, and that we need to develop some policies and some not only infrastructure, but some mechanisms to create some social protections, and not by not social networks, but just really some social protection floors that create some baseline so that the quality of life of all people are benefited. I think, really creating some concrete floors rather than some nets in which people fall through. So I think poverty seems to be a central issue for the way we can address people's needs in meaningful ways and not only see it as an income issue, because I think on the flip side of not having access really limits the possibilities of contribution.
Very good. Lynn?
Well, an interesting development, I think, has been at the UN level, we're in a new agenda, the 2030 agenda that the UN has adopted with these sustainable development goals, 17 of them. And the first one, of course, is to eradicate poverty, which has been one of their goals, I think, going back about 60 years. The UN has had they're going to eradicate poverty in a decade. So obviously it's been an intractable problem. And, you will see in the book some examples of some social work activities. Rebecca, in fact, I'm surprised she didn't mention it, because one of her specialties is looking at issues like microenterprise, which is a strategy used in many poorer countries, but also has been transported and tried in the United States as well as other countries, of helping people with small businesses. Some of the cases in the book most of the cases in the book were actually written by UConn students, either when they were active students or after graduation. So they are very real. They're taken from people's practice. And one of the cases, in fact, is from a former student of ours, Daniel Melchor, who ran some microenterprise projects in Mexico and talked about these from a social work perspective. So I think you get a real sense of what social workers are doing in the field from the case examples.
It just reminds me to say that one of the things I really like about the book are the case examples, because it brings the story to all the data. And we all know from our left brain, right brain, it's somehow that story that gets into the right brain is what we hang on to. And to have the variety of case examples and stories in the book, I think is one of the critical features. Talk briefly about women and girls. When you talked about, Lynn, opportunities for micro enterprise, what I know that I have seen through many, many years, and particularly with the Peace Corps years, of working with women in micro enterprise development and the creativity and extraordinary work that they can bring forward in a community by community basis. Also education and ensuring that that girls have access to education and what kind and further education. There's just so much there that I think links with social work. And again, you talk about it in the book, but give a quick summary of your perspectives on this.
Maybe I'll jump in on this one in terms of microcredit and microfinance projects really initiated with Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh, because thinking of this whole idea that people have the ability to run businesses, people are creative, people are resourceful, they just might not have access to loans or to cash. And partly because, you know, banks are so formal that they want collateral. And if you don't have an income or have a collateral, then you're not able to borrow. And so strategies were born so in which that, you know, there would be solidarity groups that were often created, often informal structures in which, you know, I remember even my mom sort of doing this with her women friends, that everybody would pitch in, and then once a month, somebody in the women's group would take that money and buy something out of it. And so this idea of, you know, pooling solidarity resources together, get a loan, and holding the person for repayment as a way of making sure that the loan gets paid, but more so learning from each other, you know, holding each other accountable, creating a business plan, engaging with weekly check-ins, if you will, both in a formal and an informal way, not only to grow the business, but also to create and solidify relationships. And certainly women were targeted as a strategy because you know, they didn't have access to money. And so it was a good way of working with women. Also teaching them skill sets and capitalizing on their own skill sets to run a business, manage a business. And increasingly it's been found that they have the ability, if nothing else, is to save enough to take another loan. But also, you know that if they are running a business, they're more likely to send their children to school, especially girls. And you know, to your point, to the question that you were asking about girls and women disproportionately suffer because of a very male-dominated environment, and that they are in some ways at a disadvantage. And so, you know, just preference for male child. And so if there's an opportunity to educate somebody in the family, boys are often sent to school and girls are fetching the water. So just ways of thinking about encouraging equal opportunities for both girls and boys so that a society would be helped. But recognizing that also in some ways, you know, children are a source of income because of the work that they do. And so to find ways to provide cash transfers as a way of making sure that the family that needs the income could then send the child to school. In fact, I was listening to NPR the other day here in Hartford, and they were doing something very similar in their budget proposal, saying that, you know, let's just give cash monthly rather than a tax abatement at the end, because you need the cash monthly to support families. And so, you know, as Lynn mentioned earlier, there are other successful models in other countries that can be used as examples, but which is the Bolsa School program in Brazil, or the Progressa that's been used in Mexico as good ways to enhance the capacity of girls and women in communities. So.
You know, as Rebecca was giving the examples, I know some of us might be thinking, oh, but doesn't that belong to a business major or a finance major or someone with an MBA? Well, they're fine and they're important, but my own experience suggests that it is the social work background, is some of the macro work, it is the organization work, it's the community work that really builds the perspective for women to be able to say, we can do this. And that's critical in where social work is working with women, whatever the issues are that are important for women to take on the leadership and strength that they do. Something that we all talk about is climate change, and obviously that relates to the environment. And through the book, what are a couple examples of how social work plays a role with these two related areas?
Well, I was going to, when you were asking about kind of the issues that had really changed since 2008, and I don't think the climate was a problem in 2008 as well, but it's grown in the recognition of how important it is. I think the Secretary General of the UN said recently that we may be the first generation that has the capacity to eliminate poverty and the last generation that has the capacity to save the planet. So out of that came, we have a new field of social work, green social work. A book on that by that title was published probably about 8 years ago by Lynne Rovanelli in England. And there's been a lot of emphasis on that. And again, there's a case in the book written by one of our doctoral graduates, Dr. Jen Willett, based on some research that she did in Kenya on what she called slow violence, and talked about these micro disasters and environmental calamities that tend to affect poor people. And very linked to that, you know, we can look at something like Flint, Michigan, which we discuss in the book, and what happened in Flint, Michigan when it was considered to be okay for poor people to be given a water source that turned out to be poisonous. So this idea that I think social work is addressing in terms of environmental racism. Actually, it was a colleague of ours from Jamaica that used that, was the first person I heard say that quite a number of years ago when she visited Hartford and got interested in the fact that we put our trash dump up in the north end of Hartford, where it's largely minority community. So, you know, I think these examples, again, of looking at climate change, environment. Also, if we think about how do we address climate change and the degradation of the environment? Sometimes it's with big policies, but sometimes it's with changes in individual human behavior. And like same you could say about COVID prevention. I think it has applications to women's health issues and many things that, you know, so who are the experts in human behavior? I seem to think that our profession is the ones that claim that. So how do we use our traditional social work knowledge merged with international knowledge to address some of these issues? And can that be our major role in something like addressing climate problems? But you will see that that's a considerably expanded topic in the book because of its importance.
I think, just to pick up on that I think you have both illustrated that a lot of what you suggest in the role of social work in climate change, the environment, is at the micro level. And it is about behavior. And I have watched in many countries projects that are about trash and a community, or water and soil, and different ways of stacking fish and other kinds of food. You can tell I'm not an expert in agriculture, but watching how at a community level, you're building the thinking that creates some of that rearrangement of small behaviors, that thousands upon thousands of opportunities is what then makes a big difference. And I'm so glad you spent a lot of time on it in the book, because it's all about behavior. Let's touch on natural and man-made disasters. Since we haven't had any in the last few years, it's sort of no, I'm teasing. Natural and man-made disasters and relief efforts, and the significance of these, and in a certain sense, what we're looking at with COVID right at the moment. Talk a little bit about how that plays in your book and the role of social work.
Rebecca, you want to talk?
You know, we've earlier we've spent a considerable amount of time talking about disasters and man-made disasters, and thinking about just prevention and thinking about strategies for mitigation and relief and response. And that cycle often quickly shifts in environments where there isn't much opportunities for, crisis happens in environments where there isn't an ability to cope, right? And so, in environments where there's less of a safety net, then the opportunities for experiencing crisis seems far more exacerbated. And so a lot of the work and the effort in international social work has been about relief and then mitigation, and thinking about how can you do the development in a different way. But yet the experiences we understand of those who experience disasters in the most dramatic way are primarily those that are marginalized or are in poorer communities. As the example that Dr. Jen Willett sort of talks about in terms of slow violence that people experience because the wealthy have an ability to cope or to find some other solutions. Even as we saw the example of what happened in Texas was certainly a man-made disaster in which people were suffering with the inability to find heat or shelter, and the wealthy had the ability to fly to Cancun. So just examples of the inequality that occurs even in man-made disasters. I don't remember the example, Lynn, maybe you might remember the example of a wine in California wasn't tasting as good because of pollution somewhere in China. Was that the?
Well, that was, in the chapter on globalization, we say you basically, there's certain problems you cannot solve on your own. And one of the things that appeared in the newspaper was that after the tsunami and then the nuclear meltdown in Japan, they're huge, very tragic events. They actually found radioactive particles in California wines from the nuclear disaster in Japan. So, there's no way the US can solve those kinds of problems on their own. And, some of these disasters have just been huge. And they affect all communities, but I think the poor always suffer the most, the poor and the vulnerable, and women and children, actually.
I'm fascinated by this, and I'm going to then link into COVID-19. When you were just polishing off the book was when the COVID pandemic began. So you were able to put a very nice preface in the book on COVID of about a page and a half that then linked back to all the issues because there's such an interaction. And so I would like you to talk a little bit, because COVID becomes, I think, a really good example of what is global social work and the impact here at home has overseas and vice versa. And even though it's not fully covered in the book because it's so recent, it is a great case study that I think everybody can use to draw in most of the topics of the book. And just for a second, as you get started, I have been watching COVID globally, obviously, for the last year. And your comment, Lynn, about how disasters don't honor borders. And COVID is such an example of us watching it in China and then country by country as we were looking at how our countries reacting and realizing that no one could protect themselves. There it was global, it was all of us. And watching the impact on families, on education, on kids, on those who have so little already, seen on the ground all over the world what this impact has been. Do you want to talk just a little bit and see how COVID fits back into international social work and the topics you have in the book?
I should say to our audience that, we're so honored to have Jody with us. And it was a bit of a risk because it's probably not wise to have a discussant who is a lot more interesting than the two authors speaking, because she's had some amazing experiences, including having to evacuate Peace Corps volunteers from all around 7,000, I think, Peace Corps volunteers because of COVID. So, but she's promised she'll come back and talk to us about it. So we'll hold that as a future promise. This was such a shock to us in terms of the book. I mean, it's obviously a shock in terms of our own lives as well, but the book was in production. The final manuscript was with the publisher. It been, was in copy editing, the final stages after, a long period of work, and then COVID hit. And it was like, oh no, this could be a whole different, we could weave this in the whole book. And our choice was either to pull the manuscript and say, okay, well, wait a year or two, which I don't think I could have survived, or just to go ahead, and they did let us change the preface. What it made me think about, and Rebecca and I had talked in advance, and she wanted me to start on this question. So I spent quite a bit of time in the one of the early chapters on globalization, talking about HIV/AIDS, which was another global health crisis that spread to every country in the world. I remember hearing the head of UNAIDS, Peter Payot, at the time, and he said that he thought that AIDS was the most dramatic example of globalization because it could only be spread through the most intimate of contact, not like COVID. And yet it spread to every country in the world rather quickly. So we talk a lot about the HIV/AIDS response there and the role of social work and how social workers were so critical because, again, especially in the developing world, it was behavior that had to be talked about because there was very little access to curative treatments. It was anti-stigma work and work on behaviors. Interestingly, it was a UConn School of Social Work trained MSW in Uganda became head of the social section of the World AIDS Organization and made big contributions to Uganda's efforts in AIDS. I just had to throw that UConn commercial in there. But like HIV/AIDS, especially as it played out around the world and in Africa, we see COVID having similar impacts even here in the United States. We see so many problems associated with the lockdown, growth in domestic violence, lots of concern about children's mental health, educational gaps, kids who haven't been to school. My grandkids haven't been to school in next week, it'll be a year. They've been learning online. And the situation abroad is far worse in Africa, where girls may never get to go back to school. They may be forced into early marriage. It'll be disastrous. The elderly in nursing homes. I mean, look at anyone who's a social worker in a nursing home. I can only imagine what they're facing, what happened to our elderly in nursing homes, both in terms of the terrible ravages of the diseases, but also raising some serious questions about the human rights of older persons whose decision-making was totally taken away from them, haven't been able to see family. They're basically prisoners. And again, this whole behavioral dimension of prevention efforts. And on the more positive side, the emphasis on community building. Although I'm so sick of hearing we're all in this together alone or something, whatever that phrasing is, because it's not really true. I mean, some are suffering so much more than others. But I think that notion of community building and how we've been able to migrate to Zoom and have actually nice, warm, friendly conversations. I think there has been some banding together, and people have stepped up and helped others. So those are some of the positives, and they really relate back to a lot of the talk about in the book, drawing from other crises. Hopefully we will learn from the 2008 fiscal crisis that bailing out big business, big banks, and leaving people on the ground to suffer didn't work well. And hopefully there will be more, what Rebecca was talking about, social protection efforts and relief for people who are suffering. And I noticed you also were going to mention something about maybe migration. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to add anything related to COVID.
Since the book, Dr. Medina and myself have been looking at essential workers, and disproportionate amount of essential workers here in the United States have been really critical in working in agriculture and food production and food distribution services here for us, with really minimum wages and in fact a lot of xenophobia directed towards them. In addition, they've been primary care workers in the healthcare system itself and working with aging populations. So, those that are undocumented migrants and immigrants are really working hard to keep us safe, if you will, in this COVID environment, and continuing the work that migrants are really essential for how societies function globally now. So we're living in a space where mutual dependency and is really critical. And that somehow we've got to figure out a way of either a pathway to citizenship, but also to acknowledge the work, the contributions, and provide a way in which people can live in safe humane conditions, I should say. Yeah.
I could leap in on many fronts because this is so interesting. I am going to give one example related to what you just both said. And then for all of everybody who's tuned in, I have two more quick questions. And then I want to make sure we open it up because some wonderful questions are being asked right at the moment. Let me give the quick example. As Lynn said, we've been working by Zoom for a year at Peace Corps. And with that, we've been working with staff in 61 different countries as well as the US. And what we did among the many different things we did in trying to cope, because people all over the world, our staff all over the world were also at home and had huge issues with families, extended families, and basic food, cooking, school, things like that. And so we set up what we called global coffee chats, where we had staff from all over the world. So we would have the Ukrainian driver, and we would have the South African secretary, and we would have the Cambodian doctor with us in the US, talking on Zoom about how we're doing. Specifically, what are you doing in terms of trying to support kids when you're trying to work? And are people in the family sick, or are they dying? Or how you're managing an extended family. And what happened that was so extraordinary for me is that we could see and feel and hear, see, because we're all on Zoom, all the cultural ways of trying to manage this common issue. And how we became, one, closer, but two, the learning from each other. And also, which I think comes really into social work support, how can we emotionally support? Mm-hmm. People are hurting, and we're hurting in every one of our countries in such extraordinary ways. And we could hear it, see it, feel it, and support ways of working with it. And incredibly, a certain amount of that was coffee chats on Zoom, where everyone in our 61 countries participated. So we sort of wonder, where is social work internationally? It's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. All right, two quick questions before we turn it to your questions. Social work models and the way social work works in various parts of the world are very different. And you devote a wonderful extension of the book to looking at those social work models and the way countries approach social work. Do you want to take just a couple of minutes and talk about what some of that variety is and what we learn from each other with how different countries structure their social work support, practice, models, and teaching?
Maybe we can each try to quickly give a few examples from countries that first of all, we chose the countries based on countries where we had access to good information. I think, well, at least one of us has been to all of the countries that we talk about, but in addition, we have some connections to professionals who are working on the ground who are from those countries, so we could get up-to-date information about what they're doing. So I'll just briefly give an example from Jamaica and one from Denmark, which were two of the countries that I was the information getter for. First of all, kind of one point of the chapter is I found sometimes teaching social work students that they were surprised to hear that other countries had social workers. So lesson number one was, yes, other countries have social workers. In fact, social work has been growing around the world, and more countries now have official organized social work and social work education. And probably the first official social work was not in the United States, it was somewhere else. In terms of Jamaica, we've had a long relationship with the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. So we've had a lot of visits back and forth and a lot of opportunity to learn from people. And one piece in particular, and I really thank my Jamaican colleagues for giving me an example of that helped me teach human rights, because when I teach human rights to students, they always come back to the point, well, is this really worth talking about? Because there are all these wonderful documents, but nobody pays any attention to them. Well, that's not actually true. Some countries do pay attention to them. And social workers have been a major force in Jamaica for helping that country take the Convention on the Rights of the Child quite seriously. They have completely renovated their whole policy framework. They've introduced mandatory reporting. They've done parent training, done all kinds of things. And the thing that we really learned from them is that they take a particular part of the convention that says that children have a right to participate in matters that affect them, and they implement it. We've seen, and actually seen some of these things firsthand, that they actually have children participate in policy discussions, even with government ministers, where they hold child hearings, and maybe the Minister of Education goes out and meets with a group of children in a rural area to talk about problems in the rural schools. We attended a children's rights conference, some of us, and saw these kids as young as 8 years old, standing up and asking questions in an audience made up of other children, but also child welfare professionals and government officials. So, I have never seen anything like that in the United States. And we all came back saying, wow, this is a whole new dimension. Just one quick example from Denmark. Denmark is a well-established welfare state. Their social workers, although they've made some cuts in their system, but social workers work in an environment where they can refer clients for services, and access is not a problem. If they feel a family would benefit from a particular kind of childcare, the child can get free all-day daycare and access. Of course, healthcare is a universal right. So it's very different in terms of the kind of constraints. And one particular thing that they did, again, just intrigued me. I'm not sure how we could implement it here. They have considerably lower rates of child abuse and neglect. And part of it may be parents have less stress because they don't have to worry things about how they're going to, put food on the table, get health care, and take care of their kids. But they have an intervention where for the first 2 years of a baby's life, there is I think it's once a month, although possibly it's once a week. I can't remember what I wrote, but a nurse or a nursing assistant makes a home visit to say to the parent, how's it going? Do you need any help? How's the feeding going? And it's a universal service. So everyone gets visited. So there's no stigma. And what it allows is, for some parents, the visitor can immediately see everything's going fine. And there's not a whole lot to do. So maybe the visit's very short. And in other cases, it's clear that the parent needs a lot of help in learning how to parent, learning how to discipline, learning how to do basic things, or maybe is under some kind of mental stress. This is for the first 2 years of the baby's life. And MAIS goes a big way in preventing child abuse and neglect. What a fabulous idea.
Yeah, I'd like to share 2 countries that I looked at. And one was Costa Rica. And, one of the things that I observed and witnessed there was that Costa Rica had made a decision not to have a military, but that to put their resources towards free education and free healthcare. And so again, a kind of service that was focusing on individuals and the capacity of people. What was interesting in their program and what they were working through was acknowledging the knowledge base of indigenous peoples and bringing them much more into the university and recognizing that the university needs to learn from the indigenous knowledge that exists among those communities. And so just a really inclusive way of working in a project that was, I think it was funded by the World Bank, but just how to integrate that into the college system itself. And that I thought was really interesting. And I was able to witness that program itself because I was part of an exchange. The other country that I work closely with is Armenia. And we, again, have had a long history of working in Armenia. It was prior to my even coming to the UConn School of Social Work. Our former dean, Nancy Humphreys, had initiated that relationship. And so it's been there for a really long time. And, it has been through exchange. And currently we are teaching a course that we've taught actually almost for about 20 years. And, certainly it first had a very US emphasis, and then the course over the years has evolved and changed, and that we've looked at concerns that are important to both countries. And I'm co-teaching it with a colleague there. And we're looking at issues of remittances. We're looking at issues of people working outside their home country, looking at issues tied to child welfare. So just a growing exchange of knowledge that that both our students and both students, sets of students and instructors benefit from. So this idea, again, going back to the definition of social work, international social work, and the exchange and the growth of new ideas, even as their program develops further. First their only relationship and exchange was with the US, but now they're much more engaged with the Erasmus program in Europe, and their impact in former Soviet Union countries. The learning continues.
Well, and what you're seeing in the examples that you each gave with the 4 countries is how different social work is in each country. And yet the behavioral overlap among all of it is what holds us among everything, and human rights, and which is what holds us together, which goes right back to the initial sentence of Lynn's definition. Finally, we enjoy going to work when we feel passionate about what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so the two of you, each of you, have devoted your life, I'm guessing at some point, even at the expense a little bit of your families once in a while, particularly when you need to travel. But you're passionate about this topic. Why are you passionate about international social work, and how you can share that passion with us?
You want to go first, Lynn, or me?
You go first.
Okay. Well, I'm an immigrant. I came to the U.S. As a student. I lived amidst poverty. I was, but I was raised in a middle income family, but had an opportunity to be educated. And so when I came to the U.S. To study, and while I studied at the U.S., I had an opportunity to go to institutions that had focused areas in international development and peace studies, and also, looking at social work. And so those were my formative years in terms of thinking about global issues. And but I don't know if you've heard this story, but I've shared it with my students several times. Just an incident that happened, but the face of the person is embedded in my brain in such a fierce way. I was back in India shopping in this place that's called the New Market, which is probably over 300 years old, but it's still called the New Market. And there was this little girl that was no more than 7 years old. She was trying to sell clips to me. And, as I always talk to people, I'm engaging in bartering and, trying to bring the price down. And we were just chatting away, and I asked her why she was not in school. And she says, oh, my mother was sick, so I have to raise the funds for today. But she knew I was not going to buy. And in the corner of her eye, she saw another group of people coming by, and she ran to them. And somehow she knew that they were Germans, and she was figuring out a way to communicate with them. And she did, in a way, and then sold them something, and then came back to me. And she was talking to me both in Bengali and in English and in German. I don't know what other languages she knew, and they were functional. And I was just thinking, wow, this little girl, bright, smart, had some business acumen, didn't have a shot because of her gender, possibly, and because of her lack of opportunity, and because of where she was born. And, she kept coming back to me, and she says, well, and I kept asking her, why are you talking to me? She says, you're asking me important questions. And so just that interaction forces me to think about how can we continue this work in which everybody could have an equal chance, because that could have been me.
Well, I don't have a story as powerful as that. That's really very powerful, Rebecca. I think I came at this actually from kind of a sense of puzzlement. I just didn't understand why social workers, why it seemed to me that social workers in the United States seemed to operate that our ethics and our commitment to social justice somehow were defined by borders, that they only applied inwardly. And that just struck me as very curious. I studied more political science and international relations in undergraduate school. So I knew something about that there were things beyond our borders, and just felt that in social work, we didn't have a very broad perspective. So kind of devoted 40 years of my career to try to see if I could convince at least some social workers that we should think in a more global sense, even in fact, preferably, not necessarily traveling somewhere else to practice, but to practice and be responsible, engaged citizens right here. There's probably also it was also extremely rewarding over the years to see some of our students and the things they did, went on and accomplished far more than I think, again, a graduate who wrote some cases for the book and helped us along the way back to the first edition, David Bournes, who had a career in international development, and we've had other students who've done that. And a couple of students who took courses in international social work then decided to have careers in disaster management. One of them I know went to FEMA and one to the Red Cross. So again, demonstrating this applicability. So, watching our students prosper. And then, on a particularly selfish level, I guess, the wonderful kinds of relationships and how engaging internationally has enriched my own life, both in terms, obviously, of the academic and scholarly piece, but also, on the personal level, I've just gotten to meet so many wonderful people and learn so much from them. And this has been, it's been a wonderful piece of my professional life and my personal life. And my dad was in World War II. He traveled all over the world in World War II and not in very good conditions. And I'm from Vermont originally, came home and he said there was no point in travel because Vermont was nicer than any of the places that he'd seen, and he'd been all over Europe and Asia. But actually, I do agree, Vermont's pretty nice, but as Nina Heller will agree. But the world has a lot to offer us, and it's been a really rewarding journey. So again, another shout out to our graduates. I think maybe Suzanne Antar has been on the call as well, and she wrote cases and helped us. And there are a few others that I wasn't able to track down. I don't know where they are right now, but again, we've learned a lot from our students, and they've enriched the book. So.
Thank you both. Let me just add my little piece about where my passion comes from. I'll make it very quick. But I was right after college, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Tunisia. And then after that, I came back and got my MSW. And I discovered that in class as an MSW, I tended to see things a little different than almost anyone else in the class at that particular time. And it was only then that I began to appreciate that process of having to listen, to understand across culture through a different language, through a way of behaving that initially seemed so strange to you, just gave me, for the work I did here in the United States, because I worked here for many years before I started doing international again, that I really wanted everyone to be aware that we're a global community and we make a difference. Gee, you can tell how passionate I am, sorry, but that we make a difference, often one person at a time. And whatever that culture, whatever that background, whatever that tradition is, to hear it, to see it, feel it, and understand it, you have a chance of making a bigger difference. And that person has a chance of making a bigger difference to you. And if anything, that's what I have tried to live all my life. So with that, oh my, we tended to use up a little more time than we anticipated. I'm going to turn it back to see how the questions are doing from all of you.
Okay, we are now going to have Emma and Emily pose questions that came in during the conversation.
Yeah, so one of the first questions we noticed was, with the constant and media attention to global context, those of us who care about the world wonder where we could put our attention. There are so many areas, Yemen, Myanmar, Iraq, Ethiopia, Poland, Belarus, etc., that need our attention. As social workers and educators, how do we choose where to put our energy?
Rebecca, Lynn?
I sometimes encourage social workers, it's not a country specific answer, but whatever the other piece of your passion is it child welfare? Is it health? Is it human trafficking? Do you have a aging? Is there a specific focus in your work? And then is there somewhere where you can make a difference, maybe directly or maybe indirectly, in terms of entering in some kind of discussions with people from a country you're interested in who is working on a similar issue, or through some kind of advocacy work that you might do.
Rebecca?
I was thinking that we don't have to travel far to help in situations like this. There are lots of local groups here, that are doing good work, that are interested in the concerns and in the areas that you're interested in. And, to figure out some ways in which to learn from, to understand why the situation is the way it is. What are the political factors? What are the environmental factors? What are the economic factors? And then maybe if our country is part of the experiences, then how can we advocate for differences, right? I mean, make a change in those nation states itself. So, to work in, mainly just even being in solidarity with people is enough of the work. You don't have to radically change it, but to understand the situation and to understand the context of why they're experiencing the way the things that they are, well, then figure out some ways for engagement.
Okay. Next question.
This one is, given the US withdrawal from several important UN committees during the Trump administration, how do you think the role of the US will change at the United Nations under the Biden administration? Will these new opportunities for social workers, or will there be new opportunities for social workers to get involved?
Boy, that's Lynn's question right there.
Well, I think, one of the real problems, I think, with some of these issues is that our current system in the US, we all have a role here to talk to our senators and representatives, too much, our Senator Murphy will say that too much power has been abdicated by the Senate. And so the president retains power to just basically treat some of these international policy issues like a yo-yo. So, we're in a treaty, we're out of a treaty. We join the Human Rights Council, we withdraw from the Human Rights Council, then we rejoin it again. We cut off aid for family planning, then we reinstitute it, then we cut it off again. Now it'll be reinstituted. So what does this mean? This means our allies and other countries can't count on us. So the atmosphere at the UN, in terms of the volunteer work that Rebecca and I do, this has been very challenging in terms of the US role, and other countries surprisingly sometimes still look to us for certainly for engagement and often for leadership, even though it seems kind of, why do we deserve that? But we've really abdicated our role in the last couple of years, and clearly some of that is being undone now. We're rejoining the climate treaty. We're rejoining the Human Rights Council. We're, back into other kinds of agreements. The World Health Organization, I couldn't believe that one, quitting the WHO in the midst of a pandemic. Yes, I think it will change. Will it increase opportunities for social work? Certainly, well, one area definitely will, is a more domestic, is that domestic international interface. And that is the refugee ceiling. It was cut under by the former guy, I think that's what he's being called these days, to the lowest level that I think I've ever seen. It was drastically reduced to 15,000, I think, a refugee ceiling. Yep. And it's been raised to over 100,000. So right here in Connecticut, there will be organizations, one of our refugee resettlement agencies closed because there weren't any refugees, but others will be hiring, they'll be looking for social workers, and there'll be a big need for volunteer work as well with refugee resettlement in the next couple of years. So that's very right here, but it's related to this same theme of this yo-yo of policy.
Rebecca?
And I think just in terms of the role of social workers, we might not be called social workers, but there are some skills that are so transferable, like program development, program management, using the logic model as a frame of engaging other countries in terms of program development and accountability in terms of evaluation, also like case management. So there are several roles in which social workers, have a special ability to think through because of our close contact with the human nature of things. So that we bring a special lens to it. So.
Yeah, I want to just really reinforce what Rebecca just said of the skills that social workers bring, whether you got the title in the job or not. And that flows underneath all this, as I said earlier, all the comings and goings at the political level and the international diplomacy level. And that's where the strength of social worker is. And that's where people everywhere ask for more social work talent. All right, next question. I want to make sure we get in a couple more.
Yeah. So we were planning this to be the last one, but we can do two more. So xenophobia has happened before, but at the start of COVID-19 pandemic, there was a growing flare of xenophobia in various countries. Various efforts to overcome xenophobia that have been made seem to just disappear. After the pandemic, I'm sure this problem is still getting serious. How do the panelists view this matter?
Lynn?
I wasn't clear on.
Oh, okay. Many countries have xenophobia has been a player in part because of COVID and where it came from and what it is.
Okay, so it's related to the COVID. I wasn't sure.
Related to that. So as the COVID fades away, where does that leave us and what do we do about it?
Well, I think a lot of the xenophobia actually originated more from the concern about the refugee crisis, in quotation marks. And also perhaps, I mean, this is getting maybe a far field, some of you would think, but I think the fallout from the fiscal crisis, from the wage stagnation that people have felt, how, there are sectors of our population and populations across Europe who feel that the good life has passed them by, that they don't have perhaps older men who don't see a role for themselves anymore. And, human nature suggests that you then look for someone to blame. So we may blame one population for COVID and we may blame another population for the fact that the coal industry is drying up, or that, that China or Bangladesh is stealing our jobs. So, I think xenophobia is a major issue, and it's clearly, I think there are professional roles. Couldn't be clearer here. I think social worker has, both in their everyday work with their colleagues, with their clients, and certainly at the advocacy and policy level, this is a topic for social workers to address. And I think the profession is, I think there is there's been a growing emphasis on anti-racism and anti-racist practice. And, not only in the US, you can find a nice global literature on this. Rebecca mentioned indigenous knowledge. So there's a lot to draw on in this area.
Yeah, we shouldn't let the politics of fear become the wedge issue that divides us, but rather think about what are some unifying factors that engage us to move forward. So rather than using the colonial system of divide and conquer, to be able to use a much more collaborative joint effort for change. Yeah.
Well, I just picking up on the example I gave earlier about our coffee chats. I was so astounded that the transparency of the conversation and the honesty people in whichever region of the world could begin to talk began to eliminate some of that fear xenophobia, because we would watch it as the next country was afraid that COVID was on its door and immediately closing borders and closing international flights. We don't want it, it belonged to you, whichever country they were going to name. It only as, and you can do it now by Zoom or whatever, it's the conversations, it's the thousands of conversations across the countries as we try to re-engage after COVID. All right, did we go over our time, or can we do one more?
Yeah, I think this should be it, unless Emily and Emma have like a question that can be answered shortly. That was quite a a good question to ask and answer. But what do you think?
I think there's one more quick one I think they can all answer. Are there any countries where there is not a social work presence?
Oh, that's for you two.
I actually am not sure. Now, social work, one of the interesting things that's happened over the last decade or so is that social work officially continues to expand. And countries that didn't have an organized profession with education, a lot of them have begun social work programs. A number of socialist countries abolished social work when the socialist governments took over in Eastern Europe and Vietnam and China, and they've all reopened it. China now has hundreds of schools of social work because they see social work as essential. So I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think we know what's happened in North Korea. But social work is certainly prevalent on every inhabited continent and has existed in some places in parts of Latin America for 100 years, have had social work programs. I'm rounding up a little, I think it was 1923 when they had their first school of social work, but a long time. But that's a very good question. Are there any countries that don't have social work? Future investigation. Louise, I would just say, I'm always frustrated when I'm a person wanting to ask a question and I didn't get it answered. I think both Rebecca and I are well, actually, Rebecca's, this isn't true. My email is just my name, lynn.healy@uconn.edu, and Rebecca's is
R.L. Thomas
at uconn.edu. So you can write to the two of us and we will try to answer your questions personally.
And if I just do a little ad here, if any of you have a Peace Corps related question, I'm just at jodyolsen.gmail.
Well, I have the sad task of wrapping this up. It was just marvelous. And I think we've seen the reach of social work and the breadth of social work and the depth of what we do in this set of questions and answers. And I want to thank the people that organized that did the legwork, Milagros, Emily, and Emma. And I want to thank Rebecca and Lynn for doing this. And then Jody couldn't have been a better participant, could not have been found than Jody in this, because I think we really, we're very fortunate to have her, and also feed off the knowledge and friendship she has with Rebecca and Lynn. And I want to thank Dean Heller for helping to make this work. And so I guess we have to close, but thank all of the participants for coming. It's dropped off a bit. We're just so happy. And Emma and Emily, thank you. You did exactly what, was expected, and you did it great. And so we'll leave you, and we will, since we know who you are, we'll invite you to things in the future that we do in the international social work arena. So thank you all for coming.